All right, how's everyone doing? You okay? So I was on vacation for the last 2 weeks, and my oldest son was home with me for a good stretch of that, just the two of us, while the rest of my family was visiting family up in Seattle. And so we started a woodworking project. And we had been watching these YouTube videos of woodworkers who were creating these incredible pieces of furniture. And most of them were really complicated. I mean, really complicated. But they gave the impression the entire time that this is something anybody can do, right? And you watch it and it's like 30 minutes long and you're like, wow, he created that table in 30 minutes. That's amazing. I'm sure I could do that. So some of them even said that you can do these projects without any fancy or expensive tools. But of course, they proceeded to do the projects with all of their fancy and expensive tools in their gigantic workshops. So I did buy a fancy tool, except it's not really fancy because of the tool. It's fancy because of the safety feature that was on this tool, which would stop the blade from spinning if you did something stupid. Because I didn't want my son to get hurt if he did something foolish. Right? Makes sense? So we get the saw and the wood, and we have a plan for this project that we want to do and some other tools that we needed to buy. And while I'm making the first cut with this new tool, my son records a video of me triggering the safety feature because I did something really, really stupid. As it turns out, it's not easy building furniture or really anything out of wood, even basic furniture. But doing this project has me looking at the world in a whole new way. Like everything that we sit in, everything that we sort of look at I look at it a different way. I mean, think about the pews that you are all sitting in right now. Like this simple modern design actually hides an incredible amount of artistic ability and woodworking skill. I mean, like I look at this and there's some like complicated joinery that's a part of all of this where different pieces of hardwood are put together, and there's rounded edges and there's bevel cuts and there's all of these complicated things that no doubt took really fancy and expensive tools to make, all so you can enjoy sitting here during church and while I preach. In fact, people used to not have a place to sit when they went to church. For like the majority of Christian history, people would stand during the services until approximately around the time of the Reformation, when preaching became the focal point of the worship service. So, if you think about it, it is with the advent of the long and boring sermon that the demand for pews came into churches, right? Like, we need to sit down as this person drones on and on. It's also with this focus on the sermon that this other piece of furniture took center stage, which was the pulpit, the elevated podium that a pastor would read the Bible from and preach their sermon. So, in the book of Nehemiah, the prophet Ezra is trying to lead a renewal or a reformation of sorts, focused on the Bible, the Torah, the teachings of Moses. So in Nehemiah chapter 8, this is what we hear, starting in verse 1. All the people came together as one in the square before the water gate. They asked Ezra, the scholar, to bring the Torah, or the teaching of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. So Ezra, the priest, the scholar, brought the Torah before the assembly, both men and women, all who could hear with understanding. Ezra read from it, facing the square before the water gate from early in the morning until midday, until noon, like 6 to 8 hours, in the presence of the men and women, all who could understand. And notice this, in this 6 to 8 hour stretch of listening, all the people listened attentively to the reading. Ezra, the scribe, stood on a wooden platform or a pulpit that had been created for that purpose. Okay, so first of all, before the invention of microphones and speakers, a raised platform or a pulpit or a podium was simply just a practical way for allowing people to hear and see who is speaking and what was being said, right? It's just practical. But when you put a piece of furniture, or really anything in a church or in a religious space, it doesn't take long for it to grow in meaning and in significance, and many times in height. Because elevating the pulpit, like putting it up higher and higher, would come to symbolize the elevation of the Bible as critical and essential and important to the community. So at my last church, I would preach from a pulpit that was almost 4 feet off the ground. I don't know what that is, 4 feet off the ground, which meant that with my height, when I was preaching, the words that were coming out of my mouth were coming out like at least 10 feet off of the ground, right? As if they were coming from God for all of the people. And in that setting, honestly, I did often experience a sense of reverence and awe for God's story as I preached or as I listened to other pastors who preached from that particular space. Like, it's good. Like, it makes sense, and I understand in a lot of churches that there's this sense that the Bible is important for our community, and we want to honor that. As a symbol, pulpits would also start to include artistic details that added to the symbolism of what the pulpit meant. So that particular pulpit that I preached at that was 4 feet high, they had these engraved pieces of woodwork, these carvings of figures. One of them was a pope, Pope John the 20-something. There was a pope, there was reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther, and there was a figure of Martin Luther King Jr. who preached in that pulpit in 1965, like a year after he won the Nobel Prize. So that piece of furniture carried a message about how the Bible can bring about renewal or reformation. That piece of furniture carried a message of how the Bible can bring Catholics and Protestants together, two groups who have often been in conflict and at war with one another, even violently, especially in Paris. And with Martin Luther King Jr. Etched into that pulpit, there was this reminder always that what we say, that what I said as I stood there, can further the work of God's justice, or even just the expression of, or the work of lifting up people's basic humanity. So that's good. And as Ezra was reading from the Torah on his pulpit, the people would have heard the repeated themes of justice throughout the Bible, like loving our neighbor, like loving and welcoming the immigrant because we were once immigrants in Egypt, like caring for the poor, like God's concern for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger because they are the most vulnerable in society. And Ezra's specific instructions actually in chapter 8 was for the people to feast, to celebrate, to eat together, and to prepare food for those who didn't have food to eat. That there was enough for the entire community, regardless of who you were. So when we elevate the Bible in our faith tradition and allow ourselves to be open to what it might say to us, good things can happen, not just for us, but for the world. We can be encouraged and changed in ways that move us and our world toward God's healing justice. That's good. On the other hand, when I was talking to my wife about the history of the elevated pulpit, she said, well, my first thought was that it elevates the importance of the person who's in the pulpit. To which I said, you're absolutely right. That's exactly it. The pastor really is important. I am really important. And truth be told, this has been part of the problem of the elevated pulpit because it has been used in a way to demonstrate the authority of the Bible and many times the authority of the pastor over the congregation, often in ways which are controlling, which is obviously not great. So when we step back from chapter 8 in Nehemiah, the larger story of Ezra and Nehemiah, a religious leader and a political leader, it includes this incredible abuse of power. Appealing to the authority of the Bible, these religious and political leaders pushed an anti-immigrant campaign by attacking foreigners, by tearing women and children from their families, and by deporting them. And we're all like, what? That's in the Bible? Yeah. Which highlights, and in fact, these stories are intended to highlight, the danger of elevating the Bible in such a way that it has authority over people, to control people, to domineer people. Because when we listen to Jesus, who himself was committed to the Torah, who was committed to living his life according to God's ways in the Bible, he defines God's authority not as power over people, but as acts of love and service that lift people up. Authority that comes from meaningful relationships and care for each other and love for society. This is what Jesus meant when he said in Mark 10 and in Matthew 25 that the kings and rulers of the world lord their position of power over people, and the high officials exercise authority over them. But not so with you. Whoever wants to be great, in other words, whoever wants to have authority, must be a servant. Okay, so how did we get from this history to here in a church that like half a century ago, 50 years ago, made the choice to have a relatively short platform, I mean just a few inches, elevated in the front of the sanctuary? So I don't actually know the whole story. Like our church has a long and incredible history. But as I've been talking to some people here in the congregation and as I've been reading about our history, what I do know is that this church has long been committed to our city and to serving our wider community. And a part of that, or what that looks like, is recognizing that this sanctuary, that the space that we have here is not just for us. Yeah, I mean, it's a great place for worship. It's a great place for us to gather. But it's also a great place for recitals and for concerts. Our buildings are good for Sunday school and for classes and for church events and meals. But it's also great space for schools that meet here in our space. It's a great space for interfaith gatherings, for service projects, for AA groups, and for so much more. That this space is meant to be a blessing not just to us, but to others. So I would say that the lower platform in our sanctuary is a physical symbol of our mission to be a blessing to our community. That when we gather here and we look at that, we know what we're supposed to do. So while Ezra was speaking from the pulpit, what happened in that chapter at least was that the other priests went out into the community, among the people, in order to interpret and to explain what they were hearing, to have greater understanding about how the Torah could make sense in their own lives. For me, and I believe for several pastors before me, coming physically closer, away from even this shorter platform, to stand here while preaching was always this reminder that the Bible is meant to be connected in meaningful ways to our real lives. It's meant to be connected in real ways to what's happening in our real world today. That it's not just some ancient document that is meant to be lorded over us. It's also a reminder that as a pastor who's in a position of power or authority, that I'm here on level ground with all of you. In fact, with the slope, you guys are all sort of above me to an extent. We're all here on level ground. I'm just as much a complicated human being as the rest of us, trying to figure out and wrestle with life and with faith, trying to hold the Bible or take the Bible seriously, but also to hold it loosely, recognizing that I certainly don't know everything that it has to say to us. So preaching here is a symbol of that. This piece of furniture, so now this particular piece of furniture, this music stand that is right here, this sort of mobile pulpit that we use to read the Bible from and for me to preach from, is this symbolic reminder that the Bible and the church is not an authority over you. It's not an authority over top of us, but that the Bible's authority rests purely in its ability to lift people up. The Bible's authority rests purely in its ability to inspire acts of service and love for God, for each other, and most certainly for our community and for our world. So as we gather together, this piece of furniture at least reminds us of who God is, who we are, and what our mission is to be a blessing. Let's pray. Jesus, may your words and your love for us inspire us to be a blessing to our community as we follow your way of love. Amen.